But when you go to the next page, it goes on to say, Tel Aviv University archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who was not involved in the Elah excavations, agreed the site is very important, but has significant concerns with Garfinkel's interpretation of the findings. Immediately drawing ties between the site and the kingdom of Judah is a mistake, he said, and it might as well have been Philistine in origin. Also, due to the small number of samples, the carbon-14 dating of the site is also not as precise as it should be, he added. We need to wait for more samples. It's not enough to date the site based on 2 olive pits, he said, because that's what they use to carbon-14 date a piece of pottery. So how are you going to use olive pits when we're talking about Hebrew writing? Well, that's how they do. Now, he goes on to say, he also expresses doubts about the counterpiece of Garfinkel's finding, the text. I am prepared to predict that it will be very difficult to determine whether the text is in fact Hebrew. There will be evidence indicating various possibilities, he said. And the nature of its discovery, this piece of pottery is also not unusual. There is a group of late Proto-Canaanite pottery shards from the same chronological phase that have been found in various sites on the coastal plains. None of them was discovered in Judea proper. So here comes this other archaeologist who's saying that they jumping the gun on this, and it's not Hebrew. So when we go back and we try to start finding ancient Hebrew writings, you're going to always only find a piece of pottery or a shard or something on like a wooden board, something that a 4-year-old could carve into a board. Now, if you get a piece of pottery, if you get something that's old, you can carve whatever you want into it and say it's Hebrew. You need to find stuff like we found with the Greeks. You need to find civilizations. You need to find like whole documentation. It's so unbelievable to me that these people supposed to have existed for so long. They're supposed to have existed for so long and done so much, yet there is so little about them. The ancient Egyptians are so old. Look how much we have on them. Look how much we have on the Greeks. We got a lot of information. We have structures, we have bodies, we have everything. But you can't find nothing when it comes to these ancient Hebrews who's supposed to be ancient. Their writing's supposed to be older than the Phoenicians, supposed to be the first writing. But yet, they keep trying to mix in the Hebrew language with the Phoenician, when it should be the other way around. But you can't find any Hebrew. Now, they want to sit there and tell us that, well, God destroyed Jerusalem, or he destroyed Israel like 20 times in the Bible, and a lot of the information got lost. But if he did that, why do we have so much of Egyptian artifacts that we found in Israel? Why do we have so much proof of Egyptians being in Israel, but not actual Hebrews? Now, of course, when I say not actual Hebrews, I mean during ancient times. But they want us to believe that this piece of pottery goes all the way back to the time of King David. Now, we're talking 1000 BCE to 800 BCE, somewhere in that time frame. But of course, there was no such thing as a King David. Now, we are told in the Bible, when you read Samuel chapter 5, 6 through 10, it says that King David basically gave the name Jerusalem to Jerusalem. That before he took over Jerusalem, that it was called Jebus, and the Jebusites was there. So you would have to prove that Jerusalem first was called Jebus before that time, and that there was a people called the Jebusites. You will not be able to do that. When we go look it up, this is what we find. So it says here, the siege of Jebus. Now you go down here, it says, Niles Peter Lynch notes that every non-biblical mention of Jerusalem found in the ancient Near East refers to the city with the name Jerusalem. Offering an example, the Amarna letters, which are dated to the 14th century BCE and calls Jerusalem Yerushalemu, he states that there is no evidence of Jebus or the Jebusites outside of the Old Testament. Some scholars reckon Jebus to be a different place from Jerusalem. Other scholars prefer to see the name of Jebus as a kind of pseudo-ethnic name without any historical background. So here it is. He's saying that nobody has found anything that refers to a Jebus or these Jebusites. There is no such thing. The people never existed, period. You got to understand, history doesn't lie. You can go ahead and believe this one book if you want. When you go through the actual research, we can't find these people. So now when you read Samuel chapter 5, 6 through 10, when it's talking about King David taking over Jebus from the Jebusites. It never mentions anything about any Egyptians being there. Doesn't speak about Egyptians. But we know the ancient Egyptians was there. We know they was in Israel and ruling Israel around that time because we found artifacts dating back to that time. Now, when you look at the artifacts that they found in Israel, we know that it is proof that the ancient Egyptians was there. So when you go to, this is an article from ArtNet News. It's talking about these artifacts. It says, more than 300 ceramic artifacts were excavated from a cave in Negev. Now that's South Israel. Most of them in astonishingly good condition. Archaeologists also unearthed dozens of jewelry items made of bronze, shell, and faience, as well as unique stone tools made of yellowish alabaster, seal rings, and makeup flacons, all dating back to 1500 to 1000 BC. It goes on to say, most of the scarab seals found in the excavation date to the 15th and 14th century BC. Dr. Daphne Bentor, curator of Egyptian archaeology at the Israel Museum, explained, during this period, Canaan was under Egyptian rule, she said. Now, we already know that the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites have a history that goes back to the Bronze Age. Now, I want to read to you an article from the University of Pennsylvania. They have a museum there of archaeology and anthropology, and they also have a large collection of Egyptian artifacts. So it says here on the website, Canaan in ancient Israel. It says for more than 300 years during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, Egypt ruled Canaan. Deities, arts, and technology were intermingled between the two cultures. The Egyptian culture developed alongside Canaan and ancient Israel for thousands of years. Early on in its history, Egypt was unified under the rule of a single king or pharaoh in the old kingdom of Egypt. Now it gives you a date, 2675 to 2130 BCE. So where are the Hebrews? At this time, where are the Hebrews? We're talking about the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites uniting. So if the Hebrews was there first, because they'll tell you the Hebrews was there before the Canaanites, but where are they? Now, they wasn't being enslaved at this time. They wasn't in Egypt at this time. Where the hell are they at this time period? But we're talking about here, the Canaanites and the ancient Egyptians at this time frame. We can't find these people. So the Bible tells us that the Israelites was enslaved in Egypt because they was basically growing in numbers. They was growing in strength. And the Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph, he enslaved them instead of throwing them out of there because he believed they would end up taking over. Now, the Bible also talks about a prophecy that God gave Abraham saying that this would happen. Now, they basically got this story from what happened between the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites. Now, we go back to this article. It goes on to say, the peace and prosperity of the old kingdom ended in years of civil war and discord, 2130 to 1980 BCE, known as the First Intermediate Period. The Pharaoh Mentuhotep II eventually reunited Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt to begin the Middle Kingdom, 1980 to 1630 BCE. It goes on to say turmoil once again boiled in Egypt as the Hyksos, foreigners of Canaanite origin, took control of Lower Egypt in the Second Intermediate Period, 1630 to 1539 BCE. So now understand what happened here. This is where they kind of got the story from. So you have the Hyksos, who are of Canaanite origin, coming into Egypt or coming into territories of the Egyptians and basically getting into skirmishes with the Egyptians. So the Egyptians realized these people were of Canaanite descent. So they basically said, all you Canaanites, y'all got to go. Y'all got to get out of here. So if you're going to stay, any Canaanites who stay, you have to follow Egyptian rules. It's going to be a curfew. You got to follow Egyptian customs and culture and stuff like that, or else you got to go. So they believe a lot of those people who left end up joining the Hyksos and coming back and eventually taking over Lower Egypt. Also understand that the Hyksos are believed to be of mixed race, that they are half Canaanite and half something else, or Canaanite and something else. We can't figure out who exactly they was mixed with, but most scholars believe that they were of mixed race and half of them was Canaanite. Now let's go back to this article down here. It says, in 1456 BCE, Pharaoh Thutmose III won a decisive battle against a coalition of Canaanite rulers at Megiddo. Now understand, Megiddo is basically northern Israel. This is basically what the Greeks call Armageddon. That's where they get it from. Armageddon comes from here. Now the great Pharaoh recorded his triumph in Egypt, and he talked about this. But understand, 1456 BCE, we're talking about When was the Exodus? Now, the date that they give us for the Exodus is between 1446 BCE and, maybe 1250 BCE. Now, I'm not saying any of the dates that I use, I'm not saying that all Israelites agree on it, because it's one of the things that smart Hebrews don't do. They don't give you any dates because the dates never fit with anything. But you got to date something. So we're going to go with the official dates that they give us. And it's 1446 BCE and maybe 1250 BCE. But we know that's not true. The problem with these dates is this. The date of 1446 BCE puts the Exodus during the rule of Thutmose III. So that would be weird that a man named Moses actually freed Hebrews from Egypt during the reign of a pharaoh named Thutmose. So that's kind of suspect right there. Another thing is this. The Bible doesn't speak of Thutmose III. You would think that they would know the pharaoh's name and put it in the Bible. It does speak of Ramses. Now, the whole problem with Ramses being the pharaoh under the Exodus is he wasn't pharaoh in 1446 BCE. So let's go to the second date, which is 1250 BCE. But we know that he wasn't pharaoh at that time as well. His reign ended at 1213 BCE. So who were they enslaved under? The reason why they want to use Ramses is because when you go to Egypt, when you look at the hieroglyphics, you can see Ramses bashing the skulls of what looks like slaves and chasing down and running people over in his chariot, just the way they describe the pharaoh in the Bible. But what they don't tell you is these were the Hittites. They were not slaves. There was not Jewish slaves. There was not Hebrews. These was the Hittites that you see in those hieroglyphics. They also point to hieroglyphics that show people that look like they are in bondage, look like they are slaves, but they don't tell you that this was during the Hyksos reign, and most of the people you see enslaved were the Egyptians themselves. So even if they wasn't enslaved under Thutmose III, and let's say the Exodus happened, they wandered for 40 years, they would still end up in Egyptian territory under Egyptian rule. Even if they wasn't enslaved under Ramses and they wandered for 40 years and they ended up in Israel, they would still be under Egyptian rule. We know for a fact that the Egyptians were still ruling Phoenicia. We know that Ramses III lost it in 1156 BCE. So this will be, you can factor in the time, and the Egyptians are still there. We found artifacts showing that they were still in Israel during that time. We know they was there. We can't find any proof of this whole Exodus, of the Israelites being in Israel during that time period. Nobody knows, which means it never happened. So let's start bringing all this thing together, because I'm going to show you what has taken place in this history. And you can piece it together when you start going back and looking at certain things. Now, this whole thing really begins with the rule of the Ptolemies. Everything starts when the Greeks take over Egypt. Now, we know that the Persians conquered the Phoenicians, and when they did so, they amassed an army large enough to go ahead and conquer the Egyptians. Now, after they conquered the Egyptians, they went on into Ionia to conquer the Ionians, but the Ionians got help. It says, in 498 BC, supported by troops from Athens and Eretria, the Ionians marched on, captured, and burnt Sardis. However, on their return journey to Ionia, they were followed by Persian troops and decisively beaten at the Battle of Ephesus. So now you had the Persians going into Ionia. They was getting help from the Greeks, but they still managed to conquer the Ionians. Now, later on, Darius I, because the Greeks helped the Ionians, they went on and marched into Greece to try to conquer the Greeks. But the Greeks beat them at the Battle of Marathon. And this is the whole reason why Alexander and the Greeks went on into Egypt to conquer Darius I and wipe out the Persians inside of Egypt. So now we're talking about the Greeks conquering Egypt. They have control over Egypt. Understand, they actually conquered Israel before they came into Egypt. So Alexander the Great died 323 BCE. Then we get the rule of the Ptolemy. The whole Ptolemaic era begins here. Now understand, in history, as far as history is concerned, this is where the Old Testament comes from. We don't get no Old Testament without the Ptolemies, without the Greeks, period. So when you try to trace it back to the origin, we're talking about the beginning of the Old Testament. Officially, when you go back and look at the story, it goes back to the Septuagint. And according to history, how did we get the Septuagint? How did the Septuagint come about? It all goes back to the letters of Orestes and LXX. This is how this whole thing's supposed to have begun. Now understand, we don't have the original Hebrew version of the Old Testament. We don't have it. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get the Septuagint. So we got to see, where did the Septuagint come from and how did the whole thing come about? And for that, we point to the letters of Orestes. So now understand, the letters of Orestes is just as suspect as the Tanakh. It's just as suspect as the Old Testament. The only difference is we can actually look at the letters of Orestes and trace it back to a people that have a proven history that we can see. We can actually trace it back to a people who was, proven. It has a history. We know about the Ptolemies. We know they existed. We can prove it. As with the Tanakh, we can't prove the existence of Moses. We can't prove the existence of these people. We can't prove what the Old Testament is saying. So as far as the Old Testament, the history of it lies within the book itself. We can't go outside of it and validate it, period. But with this letters of Orestes, we can do this. Now, I'm not saying that it's correct, because it's obviously not. And a lot of scholars, every serious scholar, agrees that the letters of Orestes is bogus. And I'm going to get into that later. But the whole thing about the letters of Orestes is talking about how the Septuagint came into place. So basically it's saying that, the librarian of Ptolemy, the first Philadelphia, it's basically said we need a Greek version of the Hebrew law. So he tells Ptolemy, and Ptolemy basically spends all this money and frees a whole bunch of slaves to get the Jews to make this copy for him, to go ahead and do this translation. So he gets 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to come to Alexandria, Egypt, to do the whole translation. So, Septuagint means 70, but it was really 72 people who basically translated the whole thing, in 72 days, according to the letters of Orestes. Now, when you start reading the letters of Orestes, the librarian is trying to convince Ptolemy that he should release some of the Jews in order for them to get the Jews in Israel to actually do this whole translation. Now, he goes on to say that, you release some of them, it'll be like in good favor, it'll be a good thing for them, it'll be basically a good look. And that he basically goes on to say that we all have the same God, except that we call our God Zeus. So when you start reading it, he's trying to convince Ptolemy, and Ptolemy eventually agrees. That's the beginning of the letters of Orestes. He's explaining what's going on and what happened and what led up to the whole thing. It's in very, very good detail, which is why it's suspect and why a lot of people don't believe it. There's too many details in it for somebody to write it out like that. So when you go on to read it, it's basically, the whole thing is suspect and it goes against the history that's proven. So the whole thing is, if the letters of Orestes is correct, then that means the rest of history as we know is wrong. Because when you look at the whole war between the Persians and the Egyptians and the Greeks, the letter basically goes against everything we know and prove about that war. It goes against it. So if the letters is correct, then it goes against history, and history is wrong, so that can't be. But if it's false, then it basically proves that the Greeks went on ahead and created the Old Testament. It gives a lot of validity to that story. Okay, so letters of Orestes. And this part I want to read real quick because I believe it's an important part. It's a very long letter. There's a lot to it. So if you get a chance someday, go online and find it and read it and study it. Because when you start to compare it with actual history, when we start to compare it with the Bible too, and we start to compare it with what we know, then stuff doesn't fit. It don't work out when you start to compare it to what we know. So it says here, go down to letters of Orestes, start at 35. It says, King Ptolemy sends greetings and salutations to High Priest Eleazar, since there are many Jews settled in our realm who were carried off from Jerusalem by the Persians at the time of their power, and many more who came with my father unto Egypt as captives. Large numbers of these he placed in the army and paid them higher wages than usual. Now understand what he's saying here. He's saying that he took Jews. Now let's go to the Hebrew Israelite, definitions of Jews. According to them, they were black. They were black people. Like I said, I'm not disputing that. But according to this letter, we're talking about the white Greeks took black Jews and put them into his army to fight against black Egyptians. This is what this letter is saying. So it goes on to say, And when he had proved the loyalty of their leaders, he built fortresses and placed them in their charge, that the native Egyptians might be intimidated by them. And I, when I ascended the throne, adopted a kindly attitude towards all of my subjects, and more particularly to those who were citizens of yours. You know, he's basically kissing the high priest's ass here, and it doesn't sound like something a Ptolemy would do. He's basically saying, hey, I liked your people. This is what happened, and, you know, I gave them jobs, and I did this, and he's kissing his ass trying to get this thing done. But we got to realize that they had already conquered Israel. They under the rule of the Greeks. So why all this ass kissing?